What happens when a name no longer matters? This is the story of a man whose identity opened every door until one quiet village where no one asked who he was. No titles, no recognition. And in that unexpected anonymity, he experienced something he never had before. Being seen not for what he carried, but for who he quietly was. What began as a silent escape turned into something far more profound, a discovery about presence, humility, and the kind of connection that doesn't need to be named to be real. But before we begin, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. We'd love to know. Now, let's begin. High above the city, behind the tinted glass of a luxury penthouse, Ezra Caulfield stood alone. The skyline stretched out before him, a mosaic of lights, movement, and ambition. He had once seen it as a symbol of everything he'd built. Now, it felt more like a cage made of glass and silence. For decades, Ezra's name had been a passport to every room. It didn't need an introduction. People adjusted themselves the moment they heard it. His signature was worth millions. His presence, enough to shift the air in a room. The world didn't just know him. It responded to him, like a well-trained instrument. But lately, that recognition had begun to wear thin. The admiration felt hollow. The conversations, rehearsed. At every dinner, every boardroom, every charity, gala, he was greeted with the same polished faces, the same carefully curated respect. It wasn't just predictable, it was suffocating. Somewhere deep within him, a question had begun to echo. Had anyone ever truly seen him, without the weight of his name? It wasn't a dramatic realization, more like a slow accumulation, a heaviness that grew unnoticed, like dust in the corners of a silent room. He caught himself imagining what it would feel like to speak without people measuring his worth first. To walk into a space and not be watched. To listen, not as a figure of power, but as a man. Just a man. One humid evening, as golden light spilled across his immaculate apartment, Ezra made a quiet decision. He turned off his phone, left his platinum credit cards in a drawer, chose ordinary clothes, soft, worn, neutral, packed a small backpack, and for the first time in years, stepped outside without an agenda, a schedule, or a destination that needed his name to unlock it. He boarded a modest train, followed by a dusty local bus. Hours later, he arrived at a coastal village so small it barely had a name. The streets were made of dirt and salt. The houses, painted in faded blues and yellows, leaned gently with age. The air smelled of sea and grilled fish. Laughter floated freely from windows. No one looked twice at him. That alone felt revolutionary. Ezra didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. In fact, for once, he didn't want to. The anonymity was strange, almost unsettling, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. He had spent his entire life being noticed, anticipated, adored. But here, he was invisible. And surprisingly, that invisibility felt like relief. The first moments were filled with quiet disorientation. In the city, people adjusted themselves around him like furniture moved before an important guest. Here, no one shifted, no one paused. No one cared who he was. He bought bread at a corner stall and received exact change, sat by the ocean and was ignored, walked through a crowd and left no echo behind. And yet, something deep in him stirred. That night he wandered the beach, barefoot and uncertain. Above him, the stars blinked with a clarity he hadn't seen in years. There were no skyscrapers to block them, no helicopters overhead, just wind, waves, and voices carried from nearby porches. Everything here felt unfiltered, uncrafted. People spoke loudly, without calculation. Children shouted without fear of disapproval. Nothing felt curated for effect. The next morning, Ezra walked slowly through the village, letting the rhythm of the place sink into his bones. A man with rough hands and a sun-creased face offered him a nod. A young woman, balancing a basket on her hip, shared half a fruit without asking anything in return. A boy kicked a ball his way and gestured for him to join. It wasn't charity. It wasn't obligation. It was simple, unvarnished inclusion. Ezra felt disarmed. For a man who had spent a lifetime anticipating others' motives, this lack of pretense was almost too much. No one seemed interested in networking, elevating themselves, or posting about their generosity later. They just were. And somehow, in their presence, so was he. That afternoon, he sat on a large rock by the sea, watching the tide creep in. The breeze carried salt and the scent of burning wood. Around him, life unfolded with no awareness of his presence. No stage, no audience. Just existence, honest and raw. And as the sun dipped low on the horizon, he felt a stillness unlike anything money had ever bought him. It wasn't peace exactly. It was something deeper, a recognition, not by others, but by himself. For the first time in years, Ezra wasn't performing. He wasn't protecting an image or calculating a response. He was just there, breathing, watching, listening. And in that silence, something began to shift, a quiet unraveling of everything he thought he was, and everything he still might become. What he didn't yet know was that this small escape, this act of stepping out from behind the name that had built his world, would become the beginning of a deeper journey. One that would not only change how he saw others, but how he saw himself. The village didn't ask questions. No one chased him for photos or favors. No curious eyes followed him down the path where hibiscus flowers spilled over crumbling fences. Ezra moved through the space like a ghost given form, visible yet untouched. And it was in this gentle indifference that something unexpected took root, a sense of belonging that asked for nothing in return. He rented a small room above a bakery. The ceiling was low, the floorboards creaked, and the mattress sagged in the middle. But it was quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't isolate. It embraced. Every morning, the smell of fresh bread woke him, mingled with the sound of waves in the distance. The walls were thin enough to hear the laughter of the baker's children, yet thick enough to keep his thoughts his own. Ezra began to fall into rhythm. He walked the same stretch of beach each morning, bought fruit from a woman who never asked his name, sat in the square where old men played cards without speaking much. His presence was acknowledged, but never studied. A nod here, a wave there. No one leaned in to ask what he did or what he owned. To them, he was just another visitor, maybe a man between stories. It was disorienting and quietly healing. He noticed the absence of performance. People in the village didn't speak to be admired. They spoke because they had something to say or nothing to hide. Their time wasn't currency, their attention wasn't calculated. He watched them live without strategy, uncurated, unhurried, unapologetic. On his third day, he sat by the dock, watching children leap into the water, their laughter rising like birds into the sky. Next to him, a man in faded overalls whittled a piece of driftwood into something that looked like a bird, or maybe a boat. Ezra didn't try to interpret it. He just watched the way the man's hands moved. Slow, deliberate, free of urgency. Later that afternoon, he helped an older woman lift crates outside a tiny community hall. She offered him a glass of water without a smile or a thank you, just a quiet understanding that he was part of the day now, part of the work. That was enough. He wasn't invisible here. He was simply level. No pedestal. No pedestal to fall from. It struck him how much of his life had been spent defining himself through contrast. Richer, faster, smarter, more powerful. Everything was comparative. He had rarely existed without a mirror reflecting something back. Admiration, envy, resentment. But here, there was no mirror. Just people. Just presence. At night, he sat outside his small room, watching moths dance around a dim bulb. In the silence, his thoughts didn't scream the way they used to in the city. They stretched out, uncoiled, found space. He wasn't haunted by unread emails or unreadable expressions. There were no meetings to prepare for, no voices competing in his head. Just the slow, certain realization that he was being treated the way he'd never allowed himself to be. Like a man, not a name. Each day, something softened. The way he held his shoulders, the way he looked at others without expectation. He stopped checking his phone, stopped thinking in metrics. Time became less about minutes and more about moments, and through it all the villagers never asked. Not once did they question where he was from or what he had done to arrive at their doorstep. There was no curiosity disguised as kindness, no probing wrapped in politeness, only presence, only space. In that quiet, Ezra began to listen, not just to the sounds around him but to himself, to the questions he had silenced beneath layers of achievement, to the ache he had ignored in favor of applause. And though no one there knew, his name, something in their simplicity, mirrored a truth he had forgotten. He had never truly felt heard, not until now. By the end of his first week, Ezra had begun to understand something he'd never noticed in the life he left behind, how loud his world had always been, not just in sound, but in weight. The noise of expectations, of judgment, admiration, performance. Even silence in the city had been another kind of noise. Charged, loaded, strategic. But the silence in this village? It wasn't absence. It was presence. It didn't push him inward or outward. It held him, like a calm sea around a floating boat. It didn't demand. It received. Each morning, he found himself rising with the sun, not out of necessity, but out of something closer to curiosity. He would sit at the edge of the shore, letting the warmth of the morning light brush his face, and just listen. Not to anything specific, not to solve or decide. Just listen. The sea, the breeze, the distant chatter of the day awakening. It all blended into something meditative. And in that quiet, Ezra noticed something remarkable. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't feel the urge to speak. He wasn't being ignored. In fact, the villagers saw him, not in the way people in boardrooms saw him, filtered through ambition and calculation, but with a kind of grounded, human attention. They noticed his presence, but didn't press into it. They didn't try to decode or dissect him. They just let him be. One morning, while helping stack chairs after a small community gathering, an elderly woman tapped his shoulder and pointed to a cup of tea resting by a bench. She didn't say a word, but her eyes smiled. He sat, she sat. They sipped their tea in silence, watching children draw patterns in the dust with sticks. No introductions, no icebreakers, just space shared. That was when it truly landed. He had spent decades surrounded by people who talked over each other to be heard, to be right, to be seen, to be important. His offices were filled with voices competing for space. Every meeting, every dinner, every exchange was layered with subtext, strategy, and positioning. But here, even without words, he felt more listened to than ever before. He began to understand that silence was not the absence of conversation. It was the space in which real presence existed. In that stillness, people connected without performance. No one was trying to impress. No one was trying to be more than they were. Ezra started seeking those moments. He spent an afternoon painting a fence alongside a man who barely looked up from his work. They didn't share a single word. But when it was finished, the man clapped him on the shoulder and walked away. It was one of the most sincere acknowledgments Ezra had ever received. In another moment, he joined a group of teenagers sketching at the edge of the village. One girl handed him a pencil without asking if he could draw. He couldn't, not really, but he tried. And when he handed the sheet back, she didn't praise or critique. She simply nodded and continued. That was all. And that somehow was everything. In the city, every interaction was either validation or rejection. Here, it was participation. Not measured, not ranked, just shared. Evenings became his favorite time. The sky turned golden, the air grew thick, with the scent of salt and firewood. He would sit on a low wall near the bakery, where people passed by slowly, offering nods, handing off food, telling brief stories with gestures instead of words. He noticed how people didn't interrupt each other, how pauses were allowed to breathe, how stories were told without urgency, as if time didn't need to be conquered, only lived. It was in one of those evenings that he found himself at the edge of a group sitting beneath a crooked street lamp. Someone was telling a story. Something about a lost dog, a storm, and an old fisherman who mistook it for a sea creature. The details blurred. What stayed with him was the laughter, soft, honest, effortless. Ezra didn't laugh out loud, but he smiled deeply, the kind of smile that starts in the chest and lifts the corners of your mouth without permission. Later that night, walking back to his room, he realized something unsettling. In his world, the boardrooms, the galas, the interviews, people listened for weakness. They listened to respond, to strategize, to win. Here they listened to know, not to analyze or judge, but to connect. And they listened even when no one was speaking. Ezra thought back to all the conversations he'd had with advisors, clients, even so-called friends. How many of those people had ever heard him when he wasn't performing? How many had ever let his silence speak? He couldn't think of one, and worse, how often had he done the same to others? How often had he listened only to extract, to assess, to control? The realization stung, but it also softened something in him. That night, for the first time, Ezra wrote something. A single line in a notebook he found tucked behind a bookshelf in the bakery. I have never been so heard as I am in this silence. He didn't know why he wrote it, didn't plan to show anyone, but it felt important, like marking the beginning of something unnamed but vital. In the days that followed, he spoke little, but felt fuller. He began to recognize the quiet dignity in the people around him, the way they moved through the world without needing to dominate it, the way their presence said more than their words ever could. He noticed the way they cared for each other, not in grand gestures, but in everyday
rituals.
A loaf of bread left by a doorstep, a repaired hinge on a neighbor's gate, a hand resting on a shoulder without explanation. No declarations, just connection. And somewhere in that rhythm, Ezra felt something shift inside him. Not a transformation, not yet, but a soft returning, a remembering of who he might have been if the world hadn't crowned him before he even understood the weight of a name. The air changed just slightly that afternoon. Ezra had been walking the shoreline barefoot, the sand cool beneath his feet, the sky bruised with the soft purples of late afternoon. Children ran ahead, their laughter chasing seagulls. Farther up, a woman braided her daughter's hair with practiced tenderness. It was the kind of day that asked for nothing, only that you be still enough to notice it. He was just about to turn back when he noticed a boy sitting alone, not far from the dunes, thin, maybe 10 or 11, drawing shapes in the sand with a stick. Ezra paused. There was something deliberate in the way the boy moved, like the act wasn't just play but a kind of remembering. As he drew, he would lean back, examine the lines, then gently smooth one out and begin again. Ezra watched,
unnoticed. At first it looked like the boy was sketching random shapes, spirals, waves, loops. But slowly it formed a face. A simple, childlike rendering. 2 eyes, a nose, a wide mouth, the kind of portrait drawn from memory rather than life. And then the boy paused, placed a hand over the image, and spoke softly. Too softly for Ezra to hear. He stayed just long enough to watch the tide begin its approach. The salt water licked the edges of the face in the sand, distorting it, washing away the lines stroke by stroke until it was gone. The boy didn't try to stop it. He simply stood, brushed the sand from his hands, and walked away without looking. Back, Ezra remained frozen. The moment hit him in a place he hadn't touched in years. There was something devastatingly simple about it. A child creating a reflection of himself, only to let the sea claim it. No frame, no permanence, just a temporary mark on borrowed earth. He found himself sitting in that same spot long after the boy had disappeared. His mind wandered without permission, back through decades, through rooms lined with portraits, and boardrooms filled with carefully arranged photographs of himself shaking hands, receiving awards, posing in tailored suits beneath lights engineered for perfection. It struck him, all at once, how much of his life had been curated. How few of those images actually felt like him. He remembered a moment, buried deep from childhood. Sitting alone in his family's large, echoing house, drawing his own face on the back of a napkin while the adults discussed contracts and markets in the other room. He had wanted someone to notice. Not the drawing, but him. The small boy behind it, asking to be seen. They never did. And so he had grown into someone who demanded attention not with vulnerability, but with power. He wore his success like armor. His name became a fortress. He learned that if he couldn't be seen for who he was, he could at least be seen for what he had built. But now, watching the tide erase a child's quiet self-portrait, Ezra felt the full weight of what had been lost along the way. It wasn't just anonymity he had been craving here. It was authenticity. Not the kind performed on stages, but the kind that exists in silences, in shared glances, in drawings made in the sand that don't need to be saved to be real. Later that night, he couldn't sleep. The village was quiet as always, the sea whispering outside his window. But his thoughts were loud in a different way, not anxious, just insistent. He sat at the edge of the bed and opened the old notebook again. This time he wrote, "I spent my whole life trying to be remembered, but I never learned how to be truly seen." It stayed there on the page like a confession, heavy and unfinished. The next morning, Ezra returned to the shoreline, hoping to find the boy again. But the spot was empty, the sand smooth, untouched by stick or footprint. He waited a while, watching the tide roll in and out, but the child didn't come. Still, something lingered, not just in the memory of the moment, but in what it had revealed. That child had drawn himself in the sand not to be admired, but to mark a truth only he needed to see, even for a moment. Ezra realized he had done the opposite for most of his life. He had left behind buildings, foundations, articles, awards, monuments designed to outlast him. But he couldn't remember the last time he had made something just for himself. Something fleeting, unpolished, unpublicized. He reached down, picked up a stick, and without thinking, drew a circle in the sand. Then a line for a nose. 2 dots for eyes. He stared at it. It wasn't good. It wasn't even accurate. But it felt honest. And when the tide came again and washed it away, he let it go. No photo, no plaque. Just the quiet disappearance of something small and true. It was the first time he had let go of a version of himself without fear. And in that letting go, something deeper began to settle inside him. Not sadness, but softness. A recognition that the parts of him he had buried were not gone. They were simply waiting. Waiting for silence, for space, for the tide to bring them back, one line at a time. Ezra didn't announce his departure. There was no farewell dinner, no speech, no folded note left on the windowsill. The people of the village would simply wake one day and realize that the quiet man with the thoughtful eyes and weathered backpack was no longer walking their streets. And that, he decided, was exactly how it should be. His final morning began like the others. Soft light spilling through the shutters, the distant clatter of pots from the bakery below, and the muffled laughter of children echoing down the narrow alley. But there was something different in how he moved, a quiet certainty in each step, like someone who had finally stopped looking for permission to feel. He didn't pack much, just the essentials. The notebook, now half filled with scribbles, fragments, and confessions. A small shell he'd found on the beach, cracked but smooth, and a worn postcard with no writing, just the image of a single wooden bench overlooking the ocean. That image had stayed with him for days, not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. The empty bench, the waiting silence, the possibility of presence. The idea came to him not as a plan, but as a whisper. Ezra knew he couldn't leave a monument. That wasn't the point. The moment something bore his name, it would shift. It would become about him. And this, whatever it was, wasn't supposed to be about him at all. So instead of a grand gesture, he chose something invisible. Something that asked for nothing, gave everything. He walked to the edge of the village, to a small clearing, beneath a grove of leaning trees, where the sea could be heard but not seen. The land was open, but quiet, slightly hidden, but reachable. A space where voices wouldn't echo too loudly. He met with a local craftsman, a man who rarely spoke and always listened. Ezra didn't offer context, just a few sketches, some dimensions, a location, and a quiet request. A week later, it was finished. A bench, handmade, wide enough for 2 people, smooth, curved back. No plaque, no symbol, just one line, carved gently across the wooden edge, barely noticeable unless someone leaned in close, for anyone who needs to speak or be heard. Ezra never sat on it. That, he felt, wasn't the purpose. The gift wasn't the bench, it was the space. A space he had never found for himself until now. A space he wished someone had made for him long ago, and so he left it. No one asked who had built it. No one questioned its presence. Over time, it simply became part of the place, a resting point, a meeting spot, a quiet offering. People began to sit there, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs. Conversations happened, silences too. Nothing scripted, everything real. It became, in its own quiet way, a ritual. Ezra returned to the city on a Monday. The same skyline, the same elevator, the same doorman, but everything looked slightly faded, like a painting left too long in the sun. He resumed his routine. The meetings, the calls, the scheduled smiles. But he moved through it all with a different rhythm. He listened more, asked less. And when he did speak, it was slower, softer, measured not by impact but by intention. People noticed, subtly, a shift in his posture, a pause before a reply. A new habit of letting others finish their thought before he responded. They called it maturity, grace, leadership. He didn't correct them, but in truth, it was none of those things. It was simply presence. What no one knew was that every Sunday just before dawn, Ezra sat at his desk and wrote a letter, not signed, not personalized, just a few lines, a quote, a thought, a story, written by hand on heavy paper. He mailed them to the village, always from a different post office, always unsigned, but always arriving, every week, wrapped around a book, or tucked inside a bundle of art supplies, or placed gently between the pages of a notebook. The villagers never learned who sent them. But the boy who once drew his face in the sand found a set of charcoal pencils, tied with twine on his doorstep. The elderly woman who shared her tea received a box of herbal blends from distant regions. The bench remained, unchanged, except for the people who now passed through it like a quiet ritual. Some sat in silence, others in conversation. No one ever vandalized it. No one tried to claim it. It belonged to everyone, and no one. And Ezra? He never returned, but in a way, part of him never left. The version of him that had spoken for the first time without words, the one that had been heard, not because of his name, but because of his presence, remained there. Not as a ghost, not as a legacy, but as a whisper between strangers, as a space for stories, as a gift that needed no recognition. Back in the city, Ezra Caulfield's world looked unchanged on the surface. His name still appeared on headlines and invitations. The same chauffeur waited outside his building each morning. The same assistants filtered his calendar with quiet urgency. The same familiar faces laughed just a second too long at his jokes. But something had shifted in ways no one could name. He no longer filled silences with certainty. He didn't rush through pauses or chase after outcomes. There was a stillness in him now, not hesitation, but a kind of patience that came from knowing not everything needed to be said, or known, or owned. He still led meetings, still signed contracts, still wore suits tailored to quiet perfection. But now, when someone spoke, he listened all the way through, not waiting for a gap to insert his thoughts, but holding the silence that followed, just a little longer, as if making room for something deeper to emerge. He no longer corrected people when they misunderstood him, not because he didn't care, but because he had come to understand that clarity often arrived not from what was explained, but from what was felt. He had become, in many ways, less visible and somehow more present. It confused people. They expected power to assert itself loudly, to interrupt, to take. But Ezra had discovered a different kind of strength, one that didn't need applause or agreement to exist. And while the world around him continued at its usual pace, he had begun to move differently. Every Friday at dusk, he would sit by the window of his apartment, tea cooling in his hand, watching the sun disappear behind the steel horizon. He no longer feared silence. In fact, he welcomed it, like a familiar friend returning at the end of a long day. He never spoke of the village, not in interviews, not at dinners, not to those closest to him. But every week, without fail, a new letter was sent. Sometimes just a phrase, "The tide always remembers." Other times, a folded poem, a riddle, a question. They arrived quietly, wrapped in care and left without explanation, like soft echoes from someone who had once passed through unnoticed. Back in the village, the bench remained, weathered now by time and rain, but still solid, still steady. Locals called it the listening bench. It had no official name, no ceremony, no donor plaque. It simply was. A part of the place, like the ocean, like the sky. Some believed it had always been there. Others remembered the quiet man who used to walk the beaches, who never said much but always listened. They never spoke of him often. But sometimes, when the sun set just right and the sea breeze carried a certain calm, someone would sit on that bench and say something they hadn't said to anyone in years. And someone else would listen, not to fix, not to judge, just to hold space. And in that moment, the man no one recognized had never been more known, because he had given them something he himself had never been given in all his life, a place to be fully heard without needing a name. Thank you for spending this moment with us. If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel something quiet and true, consider subscribing. We share stories like this to remind each other of what matters beyond names, beyond noise. And now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt truly seen, without needing to explain who you are? Scroll down and share your experience in the comments. We'll be waiting and listening. See you in the next one.